All right, welcome and felcha to Random Thoughts from County Antrim. And this is me, David McDonnell, who gives you my random thoughts, as well as some stories and some yarns and some history kind of buried in between. And today is the 5th day of September 2021. Moving on in our pandemic. In most part of the country it looks pretty good, although it's still a bit scary. There are some parts of the country where it is extremely scary, but let's see how we work out of it. Because I have 2 gigs, one later this month, 2 in October, and possibly a 4th in November of 2021. And who would have thunk it that there might be 4 such gigs for telling stories this year, our second year of the pandemic. Well, tonight I wanted to talk to you about the Irish Sweepstakes. And it seems almost quaint now, because just about every state has a lottery system. And there are casinos everywhere. And their sports betting is legal now in most places. It is here in Michigan. So you can place your bet on a mobile phone app. So wherever you are, you can place your bets. You don't have to go to Las Vegas. You don't have to go to a casino. But in the old days, that was not the case. The only legal gambling in the United States was in Las Vegas. And gambling of any kind was illegal everywhere else. Now, obviously, this did not prevent people from gambling. It's just that it was illegal. And it was simply run by criminals. Sort of by definition, if it's illegal, then it's operated by criminals. And what we now call the lottery was then called the numbers. And when I was a kid, I grew up in the west side of Detroit, and the numbers were run out of the local convenience store. It was located right at the end of my street. It was called Phil's Party Store. And Phil was a neat old guy who ran the store, and we used to go in there to buy candy or a bottle of soda pop. And sometimes we'd roamed through the alleys in the neighborhood looking for old beer bottles or old soda pop bottles. And when we collected enough, we would take them to Phil, and we'd receive our deposit money, which we would immediately use to buy candy or soda pop. It was decades later, actually. I was with my dad, and we were reminiscing about the old neighborhood, and I'd mentioned Phil's Party Store, and that's when my dad told me that Phil was a front for the local numbers racket. Phil's was where people would go to place their wagers on the numbers. And the numbers, of course, and lotteries of the like were illegal in the United States and illegal in the United Kingdom and most other places in the world. But in 1930, Ireland established the Irish Sweepstakes. And officially it was known as the Irish Hospitals Sweepstakes. And it was set up, ostensibly at least, it was set up to raise money for Irish hospitals. And again, at least it was said that that's why it was set up. Because the reality was that the Irish Sweepstakes were largely a con, and always was. And I think you will soon see that. Now, why was it allowed to happen? Well, Ireland was broke. It won its independence in 1922 after a bitter war. And then it immediately became embroiled in a civil war between the independent Free State of Ireland and the Irish Republican Army. And both wars did much to destroy the economy. Such that it was before. Ireland was a poor country before the wars. They certainly were after. And Ireland was deeply in debt to the British government. Why, you may say? Well, before independence, the British government financed a number of land reforms. And the Irish that were in the British Parliament pushed hard for this. And often when factions in the English Parliament, the British Parliament, needed votes on one matter or the other, then the side that wanted to go over the top with the majority would make concessions to the Irish in Parliament, and they would support these land reforms. And even those English that were opposed to any changes in Ireland and were opposed philosophically to these reforms often went along, and they did so because they thought that with the reforms, the Irish wouldn't be so adamant about home rule or even independence. Now, these reforms took one of two forms, really. There was variations, but essentially two different forms. In one form, the British government bought land from the largely English landlords who owned most of Ireland. So the British government bought the land from them and paid a pretty penny for it, I might add, because they didn't want to harm these English landlords. So they paid top dollar for Irish land. And then the British government sold tracts of these large parcels to Irish farmers. Effort to get Irish land owned by Irish farmers. Now, of course, the Irish farmers didn't have any money to buy the farms, to buy any land, so the farmers were given installment terms. So the British government borrowed money, used it to buy land from the English landlords, sold the land to Irish farmers, and then payments sort of trickled in. So the British owed a lot of money for this plan until these debts were paid off by the Irish farmers. The other thing the British government did on some of these programs is they made direct financing available to Irish farmers. So an Irish farmer could borrow money from the English government and with that negotiate their own deal to buy a tract of land from an English landlord. In either case, the British government was in debt for a fair amount of money until these loans were paid back. Now, in the negotiated peace treaty with the Irish in the early 1920s, the new Free State of Ireland assumed this debt, either directly to the British or sometimes to the creditors of the British government. So the debtor now, the large debtor, was no longer the British government, it was the Irish government. Now that certainly made it very difficult for the Irish government to do anything, certainly anything like shore up the country's infrastructure, and certainly not do anything to help build a modern healthcare system. And so the Irish Sweepstakes were born, with the proceeds to be used to fund Irish hospitals, or at least so everyone thought. Now, the Irish Sweepstakes was not the brainchild of anyone in the Irish government. It was the brainchild of three men. And one of them was Richard Duggan. And Duggan was a Dublin bookmaker. He ran several illegal bookmaking operations in Dublin and elsewhere in Ireland. And he had been previously convicted of bookmaking, so he had a criminal record. And he also spent a lot of time around racetracks and had a great head for numbers. He was known as a turf accountant because he could figure out the numbers fairly quickly. That's one of them. The other man who was involved in the formation of the Irish Sweepstakes was Joseph McGrath. And McGrath was in Sinn Féin. It was the Independence Party before Irish independence, and it became the governing political party of Ireland after independence. And McGrath was also involved in the Irish Republican Army, fought in the Easter Rebellion in 1916 and in the War of Independence in the years thereafter. So obviously he knew an awful lot of members of the Irish Republican Army. The third member of the group was a man named Spencer Freeman. He was Welsh-born, born in Wales. He's a former British Army officer. But what he became was a promotional and marketing genius. And each of these three played a different role in the system for the Irish Sweepstakes. Now, Dugan obviously understood lotteries. He had run them for years, illegal lotteries. And what he did for the sweeps is he tied the winning number to the winner of a horse race. An Irish Derby was one, but there were also some races in England that he used to specify the winner. Purchasers were issued tickets. I got a little bug flying around here, so excuse me if I start whacking. It's the time of year in Michigan, by the way, when the orchards are being harvested, and the vineyards will soon be harvested, and there are fruit flies everywhere, and I got a little fruit fly flying around me, so excuse me if I start whacking my nose. But purchasers would buy tickets, Irish sweepstake tickets, and they only cost a few dollars, and they promised millions in payouts, so they were extremely high payoff compared to the original investment. And they were very, very attractive to people in the Depression. The economic times were very, very poor. And so they were very attractive. For only a couple of dollars, you could buy a ticket. And then the purchaser completed a ticket stub, which was sent to the sweepstakes office in Dublin for the drawing. Now, McGrath was the IRA man, and he was in charge of distribution. You have to understand the men of the Irish Republican Army. Most of them were citizen soldiers, if you can consider that expression. And with independence, they went home to their families, to their communities, and continued to live their lives in a more normal fashion. But there were many men in the IRA who had nothing else. The only thing they knew was how to smuggle and how to kill. And the survivors knew one more skill, and that was how to smuggle and kill without being caught. Now, the IRA men made a lot of enemies in Ireland, particularly if they were on the wrong side of the Irish Civil War. So many left Ireland. They went to the United States, and they went to England. And they were able to meld in with the Irish communities there without anybody knowing about their past. And many of them actually got involved in organized crime. And that was where their skills in smuggling and killing and violence came in handy. Those in the United States of that ilk made a living smuggling liquor into the United States. That was the age of Prohibition. Alcohol was illegal here. Former IRA men smuggled alcohol either from Ireland or elsewhere into the United States. And when Prohibition ended, these men needed another source of income. And that's where the sweepstakes tickets came in. What McGrath did is he circulated large quantities of tickets to former IRA men in Ireland. They in turn divvied it up and distributed large packets of sweepstakes tickets to IRA men, former IRA men in America, which means they had to smuggle them across the border. In America and in England and elsewhere in the world, but the biggest target was America. And when the IRA men in America got these large batches of tickets, they subdivided into even smaller lots to people who then roamed the streets selling sweepstakes tickets. And they sold quite well in America, not only because they were just a few dollars, but in Irish neighborhoods, it was just a way to send money back to dear old Ireland and support Irish hospitals. So you had a distribution system with distributors and sub-distributors and sub-distributors, with the men in the top tier of the system being former Irish Republican Army soldiers. Now, for these IRA guys, they were used to smuggling guns and smuggling weapons and smuggling alcohol. To them, smuggling sweepstakes tickets was easy. It was against the law, of course, but again, if you got away with, in the 1920s, with assassinating British officials in Ireland, it was easy to get away with smuggling and distributing sweepstakes tickets in the United States. Local and federal law enforcement officials had a lot more serious things to worry about than the sale of sweepstakes tickets. They had bigger issues. Now, once in a while, customs officials or postal officials would seize large batches of sweepstakes tickets. But by and large, these tickets move freely from Ireland to America, and then once in America, throughout the country. They moved them by coffins, they moved them by egg crates, toys, laundry, machinery, tucked in machinery sides, and of course just plain old tucked in luggage. And even turned into a generational thing. As I mentioned, these were old IRA guys, and certainly in the 30s and even the 40s, these guys were still quite active. But as they got on in age, they taught these skills to their children, their adult children, to the next generation. So it got to the point where the distributors of the Irish sweepstakes tickets were the sons of former IRA soldiers. Now, these IRA men were usually not paid in cash. They didn't get paid to distribute tickets. Instead, they were paid in tickets. So, for example, if a man was given 1,000 tickets, he may sub-distribute 900 tickets to somebody else and get paid for those 900 and send the money, the proceeds of those 900 tickets, upstream, eventually to Ireland. But he'd keep 100 tickets. That was his payment. You'd get 1,000, he'd sell 900 and keep 100. That was his payment. That was his compensation. And then he would sell that he would sell that 100 that were allotted to him. And he would keep all of the proceeds from the sale of those 100 tickets. And none of that money ever found its way to Ireland or to Irish hospitals. The other thing they would do is, no one in America at least had a good eye for what was a legitimate sweepstakes ticket. And so once they arrived in America, it was fairly easy to counterfeit the tickets. And of course, the sale of counterfeit tickets never made it to an Irish hospital. Now, the third guy was Freeman. And it was his promotional schemes that were really brilliant. Because the tickets were made to look like currency. They're very beautifully designed. They're often better quality than the currency of the era. And instead of a currency, you depict a president or a king or a queen. On the sweepstakes ticket, pictured in the center of the ticket was the face of a pretty nurse. Now, the winners were announced in an auditorium in Dublin, and the announcement was preceded by a big parade to the auditorium, and nurses were always at the head of the parade. And nurses today, you see nurses whether it's in the hospital or on the street, they're usually wearing scrubs. But in those days, nurses wore dresses, usually a white dress. And if not a white dress, then they wore a lightly colored dress with a white apron. And they wore those traditional nurses' caps. So they were not only pretty, they were also angels of mercy, very obviously angels of mercy. Now, pretty women have always been used in advertising. It's a well-established advertising technique. But the use of pretty nurses just helped perpetuate the myth that the money would be used for Irish hospitals. Now, the drawings were conducted at a much like the Oscars. It was like the Academy Awards with the podium and bands playing, music playing. They had the Dublin police chief there in full uniform, standing next to the selection of the winning ticket, standing there sternly, just to make sure everything was done good and proper. They had nurses standing on the podium as well. They had a whole army of nurses standing next to the police chief. And there were, in fact, many, many tickets with winning numbers, because it was dependent on the horse races and where the horse finished in the race. So there were many people who had the winning entries. But the stubs for the winning entries were then put in a barrel. And the barrel, a large drum, and that was turned to mix all those winning numbers. And you've probably seen this before, even modern lotteries and bingo games, all kinds of things, where they have the winners in a barrel that spins around so they get mixed up and somebody selects the winner. But that whole spinning drum thing was invented for the Irish Sweepstakes. Now, the very first sweepstakes in 1931, they had two blind boys who were selected to pick the winner. Peter and Willie were their names. And I'm not sure why they had two, because one could have worked. But this was to give confidence that there was no cheating, because a blind boy reaching into this barrel certainly couldn't see who the winner was and know in advance or choose who the winner was. Stuck his hand in the barrel, pulled out a ticket stub, handed it to someone else, who then announced the winner. And this was shown in newsreels all over America at the time. So you went to the movies, you'd see a newsreel of the selection of the winner for the Irish Sweepstakes. Years after that, they didn't have Peter and Willie, the winner was picked by nurse. They'd have a nurse come up to again with her dress and her nurse's hat, and come in and pick the winning ticket. And who could be more honorable than a nurse? So certainly no one suspected anything of cheating. And then the winning numbers were printed. When the horse races were done and the number was calculated, the winning numbers were printed in newspapers all over the world. And then they have special editions to announce the sweepstakes winner at any given sweepstakes. Now, the sweepstakes were not, so you understand this, the sweepstakes was not an Irish government-run operation. The Irish government merely ran or gave permission for this to be done by the three men. The sweepstakes were owned and operated by a for-profit enterprise owned by Dugan, McGrath, and Freeman, and the investors, their investors. And the three men and their investors got very, very rich in this process. There was some money. How much time do I got here? I got plenty of time. There was some money that made it to Irish hospitals, but researchers estimate that it was about 10% of the proceeds. So 10 cents out of every dollar in sweepstakes tickets made it to Irish hospitals. But it made these three men multi-millionaires, three of the richest men in all of Ireland in that era. And they acquired a lot of other businesses in the process. And they also became very powerful because they were threatened. I mean, whenever anybody tried to regulate or look at the accounting, the Irish government did very little and required very little in the way of accounting of the proceeds. But when they did, these three men would threaten to just shut down the sweepstakes and close down their other enterprises, and hundreds of people would become unemployed. Most of them widows. The other thing these gentlemen did is they hired for their enterprises women, often widows. And they did that not because of any consideration for women, but because it made it more and more difficult to anybody to criticize their operation. How could you shut them down and put these widows out of work? And they sometimes, of course, bribed public officials. They made a lot of public political contributions to these officials. They brought in some as partners. So the Irish government just generally backed off any sort of regulation or restrictions or even accounting from these three men. And again, there was money raised for the hospitals, but one can only wonder how much better things would have been if the hospitals received a more reasonable share of the proceeds of the Irish Sweepstakes. Now, collecting all of this proceeds was not necessarily an easy thing, even if you had the winning ticket. 4 out of 5 tickets were sold in the United States, and the United States didn't have any luck, much luck at all, in stopping people from buying the tickets. But they did have success in stopping people from receiving the proceeds. Again, it was illegal. I just saw one example of a man, an auto worker in Buffalo, New York, who turned out to be the winner. And when the government came after him to collect the proceeds, he jumped across the river to Canada. But the government still managed to seize about $250,000. This was in 1931, $250,000. A lot of money today. It was really a lot of money then. Well, Duggan died in 1935, McGrath in 1966, and McGrath made a fortune and invested in several enterprises, including racehorses. Became a very, very well-known man. Freeman died in 1982, and he too a very wealthy man. But sales in the Irish Sweepstakes dropped dramatically in the 1960s. There were other alternatives available. And Ireland later started a state-run lottery, as did many states in America. And most people didn't realize the size of the scam until newspaper exposés and some books kind of exposed it all in the 1970s and 1980s. So the Irish Sweepstakes no longer was a thing, and certainly is no longer a thing today. I got a few minutes left, so I just want to mention a couple of things. I remember the Irish Sweepstakes when I was a kid. But I don't remember anybody buying a ticket. What I remember it is as like an expression. People today, if you find something you want to buy but don't have the money to buy it, you may say, well, I'll buy it if I win the lottery. When I was a kid, I often heard people say, I'd buy that if I won the Irish Sweepstakes. So I really remember it more as an expression. I think I'm out of time. I was going to tell you a little bit about a movie that's related to this, and maybe I'll just mention the title because I don't think I have time to go into it in detail. But there were a number of movies made in the 1930s and 40s that kind of featured the sweepstakes, kind of a rags to riches story if you talk about the sweepstakes. But the movie I wanted to recommend to you is called Waking Ned Divine. It's not about the sweepstakes, but about the official, the legal Irish lottery. The plot is simply an old man in a small village, Ned Divine, who wins the lottery. And his friends find him dead in his bed, holding the winning ticket. Presumably he died of shock. And the plot of the movie is his friends trying to hide Ned's death so that they can collect the winnings from the lottery. And of course they can't keep a secret, and before long the entire village knows the secret, and the entire village is trying to keep Ned's death a secret from the officials so that the entire village can collect the proceeds from the Irish lottery. Waking Ned Divine. It's a hilarious movie. I strongly recommend that you take a look at it. Now I am out of time, so I'm going to say goodbye. I'm not going to even do a plug for my book, but take a look at my website, clandonald.net. Send me an email at clandonald@gmail.com. I'll be back next week. After that, I think the weekend after that, I might be in Indianapolis. I'll take a look at the calendar to see when I'm going there. But it'll be soon. I'll keep you posted. Goodbye.